In this video, we're going to talk about Indigenous inclusion throughout the workforce life cycle. I have been looking forward to this one for a long time, so let's get going right now. Hi there, I'm Andrea Adams, the host of HR Shop Talk. On the show, you get expert insight into anything that relates to HR. I encourage you to subscribe to the show or the podcast to keep learning from my smart and experienced guests. But today, my guest is Gillian Hynes. Hi, Gillian, how are you?
I am good. How are you?
I am good and looking forward to this. So usually I do the introduction for my guests, but I would like you to introduce yourself and if you would also do a land acknowledgement.
Yes, you bet. And I'm Gillian Hynes, but I would actually like to start with who I am personally. And so I am a settler and I am a white woman. And that's important for me to acknowledge in the context of reconciliation. And then professionally, I am by background an HR professional. I've got lots of different experience, generalist, specialist, talent strategy, DEI, but most recently I would consider myself in the work I'm doing a reconciliation practitioner. Today I'd like to actually do a bit of a different land acknowledgement. I want to share one with you and the listeners of the podcast that shows where you might come from and where you are today.
Okay.
So I would like to acknowledge that my family is from and has lived in the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq on what is now known as the island of Newfoundland. And today I live, I work, and I live stream in Mohkinstsis, or Calgary. That's the Blackfoot name for Calgary, and that is the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, and the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Métis Nation Region 3. And thank you for having me here today.
Before we get into the steps of the workforce life cycle, can you just talk generally about Indigenous inclusion? What is going to help Indigenous people feel like they belong in the workforce?
And I like to start first with, what I sort of mean when I talk about inclusion, because there's lots of different sort of definitions and kind of understandings. And for me, and what I've been taught is that inclusion means having a really kind of safe, positive, and caring environment in which all of our differences, we all bring differences, but in which our differences are understood, embraced, and valued by the people we work with. And so it's really a workplace where we feel we can all bring our skills, right, our talents, and hopefully deliver business value, but importantly, kind of achieve personal growth. So then with that sort of definition in mind, what I would say for Indigenous inclusion, right, this is about having a safe, positive, and caring work environment where Indigenous peoples feel that they belong in the workplace. And so we always start with relationship. It means respectful relationship between non-Indigenous and Indigenous employees in the workplace. It's about celebrating Indigenous culture, cultures, plural, by the way, cultures in the workplace, right? Indigenous art, holidays, spirituality, all of these really amazing things. It's about policies and practices that support Indigenous peoples. And I know we'll talk more specifics later on. And it's non-Indigenous peoples learning the truth and appreciating Indigenous peoples. So it's not a one size fits all, right? And just like if you have a DEI strategy or you've got a talent strategy, you're doing your people strategy, different organizations will deploy different people tactics. And it's the same thing. You will deploy different strategies and tactics for inclusion because Indigenous peoples are different, right? Not everyone is the same. So that is what Indigenous inclusion is. And as a workplace, you will kind of identify the actions that you need to be more inclusive to Indigenous peoples.
Okay. I just want to circle back on something you said, and I might be imagining things, but it seemed like you really paused when talking about relationship. Is that different when it comes to Indigenous people, or is this just the same for everybody? We just need to focus on relationship.
Yeah, I mean, relationships are important generally, I believe. And I'm a very relational person. Hence my extroverted. Anyway, but reconciliation, you did hear me pause. And it's because reconciliation really is about relationship. And so it is not inclusion if it's just Indigenous employees fighting for, their space, their rights, their whatever it may be. It is about non-Indigenous employees recognizing, supporting, amplifying. So there is, I think, and in sort of my learnings, something bigger about that respectful relationship because of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and probably thousands, hundreds for sure, of years where non-Indigenous, Indigenous peoples have not been in relationship together. So that's the importance of it.
Okay. All right. So now let's go through the relevant steps of the workforce life cycle and what organizations can do to be more inclusive. So how about we start with the list and then we'll break down the list. So that is the list.
Sounds good. The list is big. There's a lot of touch points from, again, an HR lens and within the workforce life cycle that you can really dig into to identify the opportunities for inclusion for Indigenous peoples, right? So start right away with, your attraction and recruitment. Okay. And it actually even starts before then. It starts with pre-employment. And so scholarship programs to support education. Yep. Mentorship and internships, right? Build your talent pipeline. We know this, build your talent pipeline, right? Bring on young folks. Yep. This is specific to Indigenous peoples. You do the same. You have your apprenticeship programs, the internship programs, etc. But then you get into that attraction recruitment. And so is my employer brand, is it a brand of choice for Indigenous peoples? So you can assess your brand, right? You go and ideally as an organization, you build relationships with Indigenous communities and peoples, and you go and test what is true about your brand from an Indigenous perspective, what's attractive or not attractive. You can look at employment partnerships, right? There's Indigenous skills and employment offices in almost every Indigenous community. So do you have partnerships there? Right? There's lots of Indigenous student societies. Have you reached out there? There's Trade Winds for Success. There's so many organizations on the landscape that are in this sort of recruitment skill building externally. You look at then recruitment, right? You map out your recruitment processes. Where's the bias? Do you see Indigenous peoples? Are they applying but then dropping off at pre-screen? Like where is the funnel really stopping? Because then you can really identify what might need to look different. Do you have decolonized language in your job descriptions? Are you capitalizing reconciliation? Don't use possessives. It's not our Indigenous peoples, right? Don't use OUR to talk about Indigenous peoples. So there's lots of things you can kind of look at within the job description, your language, your employment equity statements. Are you looking for a particular degree, but do you really need that degree? Can experiences cover education? And then we get into the learning and development, which we've talked a lot about in a prior episode, but are we building Indigenous cultural awareness training? Do we have employee resource groups that really support Indigenous employees, right? And talk about reconciliation? Do we acknowledge National Indigenous Peoples Day and celebrate it? Do we commemorate September 30th, National Day for Truth and Reconciliation? And then we get, of course, performance and engagement, right? So what are your promotion policies, your compensation? Do you have bias? Do you have equity gaps? When you're looking at, you gather baseline data. How does your promotion rates of non-Indigenous compared to Indigenous look? What about retention or attrition? And I think importantly, it's to look at your policies. This is a big one.
If you found this interesting and informative, subscribe to see all the episodes and comment. And today's action is going to be a little bit different than usual. I'm going to ask you to read an article, and the link is right here. It's called Building Inclusion for Indigenous People in the Canadian Workplaces. And consider a place that you in your organization could start. And back to you, Gillian. So you were talking about policies and saying policies are really important. So can you elaborate on that? What policies?
Oh God,
why is it important?
Yes,
All of them, I know, probably.
All policies.
Right.
No, policies, well, generally policies, right, from an HR lens, they kind of set the standard for how we behave, our norms in the organization. And so they're really the kind of backbone or foundation to support being more inclusive in an organization. And so I'll give you a few examples of sort of policies or what might be more frameworks or practices, but just some really good kind of examples to share. Bereavement policy. So often in organizations, they're quite colonial, right? 3 days, maybe 5 days, but for an immediate family member, as defined by it's a parent, it's a child. Yes. There's these very kind of rigid boundaries about what bereavement is.
Yeah.
And so Indigenous cultures, in many Indigenous cultures, family is broader, right, than how I might define a nuclear tradition, sort of colonial family. And so family looks different. It's defined differently. There's many generations. Community members are family. And also sort of bereavement or ceremony practices are different. And it's not necessarily a one-day funeral. And so really look at your bereavement policy and sort of say, how can we be more flexible? So that's one example. Another one that you could consider, again, policy practice is in your health and wellness programs. And we create, say we HR, you have health policies. Sometimes they're fairly typical of, okay, you get 5 massages a year. We're going to do very focused on physical health. And I know we're broadening out to mental health, but even mental health is very rigid around its therapy sessions. And it's this much, maybe this many hours or this many dollars worth. But in Indigenous cultures, again, and I'm sort of generalizing, but mental wellness is actually, there's a spiritual element, spirituality. And so how does spirituality come in to your health and wellness programs? Do they have access to an elder circle or elder support? Is there connections to Indigenous counselors? Like what could that be beyond our normal scope of health and wellness?
Right.
So 2 examples. I hope that kind of gives some context, because I appreciate it's pretty big to say policy.
Yeah.
And so those are 2 very tactical ways.
Right. I particularly around the bereavement policy, I can see some employers, the dollar signs flashing up before their eyes. Their Indigenous employees are going to be gone for months because family's broader and the funerals are longer. Like, what's your perspective on that?
I hear it and I sort of say, but will it really? Right. And let's actually look at the demographics. And if you only have 2% of your entire 1,000-person workforce as Indigenous, it's not going to really materially hit your bottom line. Right. And what about the person that has to take a leave of absence for 3 or 4 months? We support them, right, regardless of who they are. And so my answer would be we support them. And I don't think the data would show that, this is a risk per se. So, so you could look at the data and you can kind of see the representation in the workforce and challenge that a little bit. But
yeah. Okay. Another question here. We went through that list of the workforce life so fast. And for an organization that has done very little, where, like so far, but they're interested. Where would be a great place to start and some impactful places to start?
Yeah. So where I would say, maybe I'll answer it in the negative and then I'll flip it to the positive. Where you don't start is just by hiring. Because if you don't have the workplace that is inclusive and welcoming and people feel, right, not even to bring their whole selves, but just bring the parts of themselves that they want to bring to work, then you don't just want the diversity focus, right? So I sort of always suggest it starting at where are your leaders at? Like what conversations is happening at the executive leadership level or the board or, and so start to have, what is the commitment from leaders with reconciliation and Indigenous inclusion? And then I would say learning, right? We talked about how important listening and learning is. So ensure you've got some kind of learning going on with your employees to build that awareness.
Mhm.
And then I think the other piece you could start with is data. What data do you actually have? Right? Do you have self-ID? Do you know your workforce representation?
Right.
Because at least with the data side, then you can start to also identify where are the gaps, where are the opportunities. And so leaders committed, get learning in the organization going, and get the data to identify, and then you can start to build.
Right. And that will indicate where you should go next. That's great.
I think it'll help guide you. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So Indigenous inclusion needs to, maybe it doesn't need to, but I'll propose that it needs to fit with our other inclusion activities. So how does that work? How do we do all the inclusion stuff?
We get asked this question quite a bit at Rise Consulting and the work that we do. Yeah. And honestly, Indigenous inclusion, there's quite a few integration points in an organization. So certain, and I'll come back to the HR side in a second, but supply chain, right? Are you diversifying your supply chain and have Indigenous suppliers? It's, what are your leaders committed to in this space? It's where does Indigenous fit in your ESG and sustainability reporting? But certainly then we get asked, where does it come into DEI? From my experience and kind of my perspective, it's when we really focus on creating inclusive environments for one equity deserving group, oftentimes we're then ending up creating an inclusive environment for everybody. And so you often see Indigenous inclusion as, one of the focus areas in a DEI strategy, as an example. And you'll see things like ERGs or, employee resource groups, you'll see affinity spaces, you'll see strategy. So certainly it could come in from that perspective as a pillar. But what I would say is you're going to be really creating these kind of beliefs and systems that support Indigenous peoples, but that are actually welcome and kind of belonging to all of us.
Okay, a final question here.
Yeah.
So you have had a lot of advice here for HR, but anything else to wrap it up?
What I would say is, for me, if I could kind of leave listeners with anything, it is so important as to how we show up and behave as HR professionals in this space. And so I'll caveat by saying I'm not a trauma-informed professional by any means, but we need to understand the intergenerational trauma and impact that Indigenous peoples have faced and continue to face. So as HR professionals, we have to be mindful of these traumatic experiences in our interactions. And it's not it's not to exclude, but it's to be mindful. So it's empathy. It's having an awareness of might be triggering in discussion, right? Or conversation. It's really important is consent-based, right? Hey, I really want to talk about this difficult kind of moment that I observed in the meeting. Are you okay to receive the conversation right now? It's just simply sort of asking permission and being clear, like articulating, okay, these are going to be the next steps, right? You've raised this complaint. It's being really transparent about some of that process, or even verbalizing, right? Verbalizing when you're thinking. Because if an Indigenous employee has come to you and raised something, they've kind of opened up to you, just sort of say, hey, I need a minute. I really need to kind of digest this. Please know, vice versa, that you can pause anytime, take the time you need. So again, I'm still learning so much in this space, but I would say that empathetic approach and a lot of that sort of consent-based kind of conversation is important from an HR lens.
Once everyone feels included, Indigenous people will feel included, or even if you start with the Indigenous inclusion, it will
yeah, right.
breathe through
by having more flexible policies. Right. That benefits many, many people. By broadening out your health and wellness programs to include different definitions of wellness, that will benefit many people.
Thanks, Gillian. That was so informative. Gillian and I did an episode on reconciliation, and that episode's right here. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.